Don't blame the apple. This is the fruit that actually ruined Eden. Welcome back to my channel. Today, I just wanted to kind of delve into why it is that the entire world blames the apple for destroying paradise when the Bible doesn't even mention that there is one. We're going to peel back the layers of a century-old tradition to reveal the literal reality of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and its fruit. So if you're ready to do a deep dive into the scriptures to find out the truth about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, please like and subscribe to the channel for more spiritual content like this. All right, let's jump in. So, what was the real fruit, and how come we don't even know about it? So, an early church father in the 4th century took the word malice, it's the Latin word for apple, and created the pun, malice brought malice into the world. That phrase basically took on a life of its own after that. Early artists started painting pictures of the apple into the story of Eden, and that's kind of how we came up with that whole idea. But God is saying, no, we're not doing that. As I was getting ready to do this study, He revealed to me that the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was actually not an apple at all, guys. So here's what happened. I'm doing a study, right? I'm preparing for it. He turns my attention to a palm tree that's sitting maybe about 100 feet in front of me, and it had these drupes hanging from the tree. And to be honest, I didn't even know what it was that was hanging from the tree. I thought maybe it was like nuts or something like that because it was a palm tree. So I decided to go ahead and Google it and, figure out, what it was, that I was looking at. So it turns out it was actually dates. It was a date palm tree. And the dates were hanging from the tree in clusters. And it made me think back to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then I started thinking, like, why would it even matter what kind of fruit was on the tree? Why is God actually having me focus on the tree? The Bible doesn't even mention it, right? But here's why. Most of us are familiar with the story of Adam and Eve, right? So when Eve ate the fruit, right after her conversation with the serpent in Genesis chapter 3, it says, the woman was convinced. She saw that the tree was beautiful and its fruit looked delicious, and she wanted the wisdom it would give her. So she took some of the fruit and ate it. Okay, let's focus on this particular scripture. Genesis chapter 3 says, she took some of the fruit and ate it, right? So let me ask you this. How do you take some of an apple? You can tell me in the comments. I'll wait. How do you take some of an apple? Yeah, you don't, right? You actually take the whole thing. And if you've listened to, my previous videos, this is what I've been saying about taking the things that we hear and just accepting it as truth, just because it, society says so, right? So actually in ancient Hebrew, our word for some means a portion of. So in the scriptures, when it says she took some of the fruit, that actually implies that there's more than one, right? So if you take a portion, you're not just taking one. Otherwise, it would say she took a piece of the fruit, right? So going back to my example about the palm tree in front of me, just like the dates that were hanging from the tree, the fruit had to have been something that grew in clusters or pairs, right? This is actually what God was trying to show me. Going back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, it says, "Then she gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it too. After Eve had eaten her portion, then she gave some to Adam, who also had a portion." Okay? So, meaning that he had more than one as well. And if you notice, once they ate the fruit, their eyes were open to the fact that they were naked. So Genesis chapter 3 verse 7 says, "At that moment their eyes were opened, and they suddenly felt shame at their nakedness." So what did they do after they realized they were naked? Eat another apple? No. They actually tried to cover themselves up. That became their priority at the moment, right? The rest of the verse says, "So they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves." After reading these scriptures and doing a little bit of research, I realized that the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil must have been either grapes or figs. Because remember, when I told you, God showed me the clusters from that tree, right? So let's go ahead and break it down a little bit more. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 7, it says, "So they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves." Now, remember how I said in the previous video how God leaves us little breadcrumbs? The leaves that Adam and Eve used to cover themselves were actually fig leaves, okay? So that's our first clue, right? So then doing more research, I found out that the leaves of a mature fig tree back in, back in the day, were not just big, but that they were actually strong and like pliable as well. So they were like maybe 7 or 8 inches long, right? So sewing a couple of these leaves together would have been enough to make like a loincloth for Adam and like maybe a little apron or whatever for Eve, right? So then you have to determine, what type of fig tree this was. You have to look at the leaves and also the fruit and how it grows on the actual tree. And you pair that with the facts that the Bible gives us that they use fig leaves to cover up, right? So putting all those things together and what God showed me, I believe that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that was sitting right in the middle of the garden was actually an ancient sycamore fig tree. Now, here's an interesting fact, right? Even though the leaves on this tree were sufficient enough to cover body parts, right? They were also very caustic. And when I say caustic, I mean that Adam and Eve actually, when they took these leaves from the tree, the leaves would have been leaking like the sticky white sap, from the tree because the type of tree it was, right? And that sap probably caused a lot of itching and burning and irritation to their bodies. Here I am still thinking, why does it matter about the fruit, right? But the thing is that uncovering the myth about the apple actually exposes something deeper, something bigger, right? So if God had actually told Adam and Eve not to eat the fruit from the tree, they'd given them boundaries as far as the tree was concerned, why was it then that Eve is given an extra warning about not touching the fruit? That's the question. So proving that the fruit was not an apple does something even more profound if you think about it. It really exposes her real secret struggle, this thing that she really was struggling with. So it reveals that the fruit was basically the very last thing that triggered what was going on inside of her. And this is what we talk about in part 2 video, the second video, right? So we're going to be looking at the one thing in Eve that convinced her that the fruit was actually okay to eat. You can check that out in the second part of this video, titled The Eden Ambition, right? And we're going to just discuss what that secret thing was that Eve struggled with, right? That's basically it for this study, guys. And I hope it gave you some valuable insight into the scriptures and helps bring you closer in your own personal walk with God. So have a great evening, and I'll see you next week for part 2. Okay? Take care. God